Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you a story about ancient Rome. Sit back, immerse story, and drift off to sleep peace. First, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment down in an introduction. The Eternal City and ETS Demons Rome, a name that echoes through the corridors of history like thunder through marble halls. For over 1,000 years, this city sat at the center of the known world, a colossus of stone and ambition, law and war, beauty and unspeakable violence. It gave the world its roads, its legal codes, its architecture, its language. But it also gave the world something else entirely. A parade of men so extraordinary in their excess, so breathtaking in their madness, so terrifying in their power, that 2,000 years have not been enough to forget them. This is not a story of Rome's greatness alone. This is the story of what happens when absolute power meets a human mind that was never designed to hold it. When one man can decide on a whim who lives and who dies. When the line between God and mortal is not just blurred, deliberately erased. When the Senate, that ancient body of patricians and tradition, finds itself applauding a tyrant out of sheer terror, hoping, if they clap loudly enough, he will not remember their names when the executioners come. The men you are about to meet were not ordinary villains. They were emperors, generals, and politicians who bent the greatest civilization on earth to their will, and in doing so, revealed the darkest corners of human nature. Some were born to madness. Others were driven there by power, by paranoia, by poison, or by the simple, intoxicating realization that no one could stop them. And some, perhaps the most fascinating of all, were not mad at all, but merely cruel in ways so calculated and so profound that sanity itself seems an inadequate word to describe what they became. Walk now through the gates of history. Leave your modern world behind. Step into the smoke and marble of ancient Rome, where the greatest empire the world had ever seen was governed again and again by men who made the darkness visible. Chapter 1. Caligula. The god Woe-Blade, he was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, son of the beloved Domanius and Germanicus and his wife Agrippina the Elder, and from the very beginning, his life was a story of extremes. As a small child, he accompanied his father on military campaigns along the Rhine frontier, toddling through the legionary camps in tiny soldiers' boots. Collegae, the soldiers called them, and so they gave the boy a nickname that history would never let him escape. Little Boots. Caligula, a name that sounded almost tender, almost warm. A name that would one day become synonymous with terror. His early childhood was idyllic in the rough, martial way of a Roman general's household. The legionaries adored him, this small boy who wore a miniature uniform and saluted like a soldier. But the warmth of that memory was soon drowned in grief. His father Germanicus died in Syria in the year 19 AD, poisoned on the orders of the Emperor Tiberius, who had grown jealous of the beloved general's popularity. After that, the family fell apart like a ship in a storm. His mother was arrested and exiled, where she eventually starved herself to death. His brothers were imprisoned and executed. Caligula himself was taken in to live under the watchful eye of Tiberius on the island of Capri, a gilded cage presided over by an old man who trusted no one and killed without hesitation. Those years on Capri marked Caligula in ways that historians still debate. He watched Tiberius rule through fear and suspicion. He witnessed executions and betrayals. He learned to smile when he was terrified, to flatter when he hated, to wait. The philosopher Seneca, writing later, said that Caligula had never been a good learner of anything except cruelty. That under Tiberius, he absorbed every lesson about power that darkness could teach. Yet when Tiberius died in 37 AD, and there are persistent rumors that Caligula helped him along to death, perhaps smothering the old emperor with a pillow, the Roman world erupted in joy. Caligula was 24 years old, young, handsome, the son of the beloved Germanicus. The streets of Rome were filled with celebrations. Sacrificial animals were slaughtered by the tens of thousands in thanksgiving. He wept with relief. An era of tyranny was over. A golden age was beginning. It lasted approximately 7 months. Caligula's first actions as emperor were genuinely, remarkably good. He recalled political exiles. He destroyed the secret files of informers that Tiberius had used to terrorize the Senate. He staged lavish games and distributed money to the people. He treated the Senate with courtesy and the army with generosity. For a brief, shining moment, Rome believed it had found ideal emperor. Then he fell ill. In the autumn of 37 AD, Caligula suffered what the ancient sources describe as a severe physical and mental breakdown. The nature of the illness has been debated endlessly. Some modern historians suggest hyperthyroidism. Others, epilepsy. Others, a simple fever that damaged the brain. And there are those who argue, not without reason, that the illness itself is largely irrelevant, that what the ancient sources call madness was simply power stripping away the careful mask that years of fear and survival had taught a young man to wear. Whatever the cause, the man who emerged from that sickbed was not the same man who had entered it. What followed over the next 3 years was a reign that made even hardened Romans stop breathing mid-sentence when they spoke of it. Caligula declared himself a living god. Not metaphorically, not in the polite theological sense that emperors traditionally accepted divine honors, but literally, practically, with costume and ceremony. He appeared in public dressed as various deities: Jupiter, Neptune, Bacchus, even the goddess Diana, adopting female dress and mannerisms on occasion. He is said to have conversed with the statue of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting, and anyone who happened to ask what the god had said was liable to find themselves in serious difficulty. He executed people with astonishing casualness. He had men thrown to wild beasts as entertainment, sometimes when the regular criminal supply ran low, substituting spectators pulled at random from the crowd. He made senators run alongside his litter in their togas, jogging to keep pace as he was carried through the city, and then mocked them for their exhaustion. He supposedly made his favorite horse, Incititus, a consul, It's a story that may be more satirical than literal. Pointed insult aimed at the Senate rather than a new appointment, but which tells you everything about how Roman contemporary emperor perceived his contempt for traditional institutions. His sexual appetites, as recorded by the ancient sources, were extravagant and coercive. He was said to have slept with senators' wives, inviting couples to dinner and then taking the woman away while the husband sat and stared at his plate. He invited prominent men to bring their sisters and daughters to his entertainments, where his interest in them was far from purely social. Ancient writers like Suetonius catalog these behaviors with a combination of horror and particular relish that scandal writing has always inspired, and historians have debated how much to believe. But even if only a fraction is accurate, the picture is deeply disturbing. He executed his cousin and co-heir Gemellus early in his reign, allegedly because Gemellus had been taking an antidote to poison. Evidence: Caligula concluded, with lethal logic, that the young man expected to be poisoned, and therefore was plotting to poison first. He had his father-in-law executed. He had his grandmother Antonia's health so aggressively neglected that she died, and he did not attend her funeral. He exiled his own sisters when they became politically inconvenient, after having previously treated them with excessive, troubling familiarity. The famous story of his bridge across the Bay of Baiae deserves particular attention. In 39 AD, Caligula ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge, string nearly 3 miles across the bay between the towns of Baiae and Puteoli, using hundreds of merchant ships lashed together and covered with soil and paving stones to create a road. Then, dressed in the breastplate said to have once belonged to Alexander the Great, he rode his horse across it and back for 2 days. The ancient writer Suetonius says this was done to mock a prophecy that had once said Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. The actual cost, in money drained from the treasury, in merchant ships taken from commerce, in the disruption to grain supply, was fad. But Caligula had a point to prove. He always had a point to prove. His end came on the 24th of January, 41 AD. He was 28 years old. The assassination was carried out by officers of the Praetorian Guard, led by a man named Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula had routinely humiliated with crude jokes about his masculinity. There is a dark poetry in that the man who ended the reign of Rome's most theatrical madman was motivated, in part, by the accumulated weight of insults delivered in the corridors of power. Caligula was stabbed 30 times in a covered walkway beneath the Palatine Hill. His wife and infant daughter were killed shortly afterward, ensuring there would be no heir to carry on his line. Rome breathed again, but it did not learn. It never learned. Chapter 20. Nero, the artist on the throne of fire, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The name alone carries the weight of centuries of infamy. He is remembered as the man who fiddled while Rome burned, though the fiddle not yet been invented, and the story is almost certainly false. He is remembered as the man who murdered his own mother. And that part, unfortunately, is true. He is remembered as a persecutor of Christians, as a tyrant whose name became a byword for imperial cruelty across 2,000 years of Western history. But Nero was also something else, something stranger and in many ways more interesting than a simple monster. He genuinely believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was an artist, a poet, a musician, an actor, a charioteer. And the tragedy of Nero, if one can use the word tragedy for a man who caused so much suffering, is that the empire he ruled was absolutely the wrong stage for the performance he wanted to give. He was born in 37 AD, the same year Caligula became emperor, to a mother named Agrippina the Younger and a father named Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, whose character the ancient sources describe in terms that suggest Nero's talent for cruelty may have been inherited. His father allegedly ran over a child with his chariot in the Appian Way as a demonstration of his contempt for the lower orders. He gouged out the eye of a Roman knight for protesting too loudly. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely terrible person, and he died when Nero was 3 years old, perhaps saving the world from any further impressions of his personality. It was Agrippina who shaped Nero, and understanding Nero requires understanding her. Agrippina the Younger was one of the most extraordinary women in Roman history. Politically brilliant, utterly ruthless, and burning with ambition on behalf of her son that bordered on the pathological. She had survived the reign of her brother Caligula, during which she had been exiled and humiliated. She had maneuvered herself into marriage with the Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and persuaded him to adopt Nero and name him heir over his own biological son, Britannicus. She had arranged for Claudius to be poisoned with mushrooms. That what the sources say, and there is no compelling reason to disbelieve them. She had done all of this, every calculation and every murder, for Nero. And Nero grew up, and he did not want what she had built for him. He was 17 when he became emperor in 54 AD, guided initially by his mother and by his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, I the praetorian prefect Burrus. His early reign was, like Caligula's, genuinely promising. Seneca later called this period the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 years of Nero, suggesting that the early part of the reign represented the best of what the emperor could have been. Taxes were reduced. The Senate was treated with respect. Justice administered with relative consistency. There were those who looked at the young Nero and believed that Rome had found something rare, a good emperor who might actually remained good. But Agrippina would not let him be. She hovered, she intervened, she made it clear in every interaction that she had made him and could unmake him. She supported his half-brother Britannicus as a potential rival. She interfered in his romantic affairs, shrewdly and overtly and by implication, that her usefulness to him could be redirected, that her political connections and her iron will could serve another master just as easily. The relationship between them deteriorated from tension to hatred with remarkable speed, and in 55 AD, Nero, how had Britannicus poisoned at a dinner party? The boy dying in convulsions on the floor, while Nero calmly told the other guests that he was having an epileptic fit, and they should all continue eating. His obsession with performance began to manifest with increasing force. He wanted to sing, to play the lyre, to race chariots, to act on the public stage. These were not the pastimes of a Roman emperor. They were the occupations of slaves and freedmen, and the desperately poor. Roman aristocratic culture had very firm ideas about the dignity of public performance. To appear on stage was to debase oneself below the level of a respectable citizen, let alone a ruler of the known world. Nero did not care. He performed at private gatherings first, then at larger venues, then finally, and the Roman aristocracy watched in appalled silence as their emperor sang songs and played music, while senators were forced to applaud. Agrippina's end came in 59 AD. The story of how Nero killed her is one of the most extraordinary episodes in Roman history. Not for its brutality alone, but for its sheer, almost farcical incompetence. Attempt was an engineered shipwreck, a collapsible boat designed to sink and drown her in the Bay of Baiae. Agrippina's boat sank precisely as planned. Agrippina, being Agrippina, simply swam to shore. She sent a messenger to Nero informing him that she had survived a terrible accident and that he should not worry about her. Nero, receiving this message, understood immediately that she knew what he had done. He sent men with swords. The ancient account given by Tacitus describes Agrippina's death with unforgettable power. When the assassins came for her in her villa, she reportedly bared her abdomen and said, with perfect composure, "Strike the womb that bore him." The soldiers stabbed her repeatedly until she died. Nero came to look at her body afterward and reportedly remarked upon the quality of her physical form. His response to her death publicly was to claim that she had been plotting against him and had committed suicide when the plot was discovered. The Senate, in the manner of Roman senates confronting imperial murder, sent congratulations. The years that followed saw Nero increasingly shed any remaining pretense of traditional imperial dignity. He divorced and exiled his first wife, who was the daughter of Claudius, and represented the Gingas in connection to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and married his mistress Poppaea Sabina. Octavia was later accused of adultery, exiled again, and then executed, her head reportedly sent to Poppaea as a gift. He kicked his pregnant second wife, Poppaea, to death during an argument, allegedly in a fit of rage, though she had been for years the dominant influence in his life and the woman he genuinely loved, which makes the act one of the great darknesses in a reign full of them. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD remains one of history's most debated events. The fire burned for 6 days, destroying 3 of Rome's 14 districts entirely and severely damaging 7 more. Nero was at his villa in Antium when it started, and he returned to the city and organized relief efforts, opening his gardens to the homeless, arranging food distribution, directing reconstruction. The story that he sang about the fall of Troy while watching the city burn is almost certainly propaganda spread by his enemies. And yet, the rumors that he had started the fire deliberately to clear land for his enormous building project, the Golden House, the Domus Aurea, were widespread enough to require a response. That response was the persecution of Christians who were accused of the arson and who suffered horrific executions in the public. History cannot say with certainty. The Domus Aurea itself deserves a moment of attention because it tells you everything about how Nero understood himself and his relationship to Rome. It was an enormous complex covering somewhere between 100 and 300 acres in the heart of the city. A palace surrounded by parkland with an artificial lake, porticos a mile long, rooms decorated with ivory and gold, and rotating ceilings that showered guests with flowers and perfume, and at the entrance, a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, 30 meters tall, modeled on the sun god Helios. When it was completed, Nero reportedly said, now he was finally beginning to live like a human being. His contemporaries understood the implication that ruling an empire had been beneath him, and that the Golden House was the appropriate dwelling for something more than a man. His reign ended in 68 AD, not through assassination, but through the accumulated weight of rebellion. Provinces revolted. The armies chose new generals. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. He fled Rome with a handful of old men and hid in a suburban villa, while in the city, horsemen were dispatched to bring him back for execution. The Roman method of killing a public enemy being clamp the head in a forked and beat the body with rods until death. Nero could not bring himself to carry out the suicide that Roman dignity demanded. He needed help. A freedman named Epaphroditos held the sword while Nero pressed his own throat against it. His last words, as recorded by Suetonius, were, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. Chapter 3. Domitian, the emperor Ambierc in the Joyous Flavius Domitianus was the younger son of the emperor Vespasian, and from the beginning of his life, he existed in shadow. His older brother Titus was everything a Roman emperor was supposed to be. Charming, militarily brilliant, beloved by soldiers and senators alike. Domitian was none of these things, or at least not conspicuously, and the awareness of that contrast shaped him in ways that made his eventual reign one of the most systematically terrifying that Rome had ever experienced. He became emperor in 81 AD when his brother Titus died unexpectedly of fever, and the Rome that he inherited was in many ways in excellent condition. Vespasian had restored stability after the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. Titus had managed the destruction of Jerusalem and the devastating eruption of Vesuvius with competence and genuine passion. The treasury was sound, the armies were loyal, the frontiers were holding. Domitian had everything he needed to be a successful emperor. He chose instead to be a tyrant, but a tyrant of a particular, distinctive kind. One who was efficient, who was administratively gifted, who built more than almost any emperor before, or after him, and who simultaneously destroyed the Senate's sense of safety with a systematic, patient, almost methodical cruelty that his victims found more terrifying than open rage. He was intensely interested in religion, but particularly in the cult of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and craft and war, whom he regarded as his personal patron. He built temples and held elaborate celebrations in her honor. He was meticulous about Roman religious observance in ways that some emperors were not. This religiosity coexisted without apparent contradiction with his habit of having people executed, often on charges of impiety or apiety or atheism. Charges that, in the Roman context, could be applied with flexible creativity to anyone who was suspected of following Judaism, Christianity, or simply of failing to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for the imperial cult. His relationship with the Senate was central drama of his reign, and it played out over 17 years as a slow catastrophe in slow motion. He was hostile to the Senate from the beginning, contemptuous of what he saw as their pretensions, suspicious of their wealth and connections and ancestral prestige. He appointed himself self-censor, censor in perpetuity, giving himself permanent authority over the composition of the Senate itself. The power to expel members and determine who was worthy of membership. He used this power. He used it frequently. Senators who seemed too independent, too popular, too connected to the memory of earlier, more senatorial regimes found themselves facing treason charges, exile, or death. The dinner party he threw, if that word can be applied to it, for senators and their escorts during one particularly tense period of his reign, has entered history as one of the most deliberately sadistic theatrical performances ever staged by a Roman emperor, which is saying something. The invitations went out to senior senators and knights. The guests arrived at the palace to find the dining room decorated entirely in black walls, black floors, black ceiling. Each guest was given headstone-shaped tablet with his own name written on it. The dishes served were the kinds of food-associated funeral rites. Black-robed slave boys, who've been painted black, circled the room in silence. The mission himself talked about death, about the suddenness with which could take a person, about the nature of the afterlife, through the entire meal. Then he sent his guests home. That same night, messengers arrived at each guest's house, and the guests, alone in the dark after that dinner, waiting, can only have been certain that those messengers were coming to kill them. In fact, the messengers delivered gifts, the headstones now rendered in silver, and the food vessels from the dinner in gold. Domitian's point was made with perfect clarity, without a single person harmed. He had shown them all, effortlessly, that their lives were entirely in his hands, and that he chose when and whether to close his fist. His assassination came in 96 AD, organized not by his political enemies in the Senate, but by people in his own household. Freedmen, his wife Demetria Longina, who was apparently informed that her name was on a list of people scheduled for execution, and drew the only logical conclusion to him. Domitian was stabbed 7 times. He fought back, trying to gouge out his assassin's eyes with his bare hands and grasping at the blade of the knife. He was 35 when he became emperor. He was 44 when he died. His body was carried away on a common stretcher by a public undertaker. The Senate, when informed of his death, erupted into the most extravagant celebrations since the death of Caligula, vowing to destroy his statues and erase his name from public inscriptions. The ultimate Roman punishment, damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. They had been waiting 17 years for the chance. Chapter 4. Commodus, the Hercules of Rome, their particular kind of historical tragedy in the story of Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus. Marcus Aurelius was, by almost universal consensus, the finest emperor Rome ever produced. As a philosopher who wrote one of the great works of ancient thought, who governed with wisdom and restraint, who spent his reign fighting necessary wars along the Danube frontier with genuine reluctance, longing to return to philosophy and peace. He was the emperor Plato had dreamed of. He was also the father of Commodus, which demonstrates, if nothing else, that virtue is not hereditary. Lucius Aurelius Commodus was born in 161 AD. The same year his father became emperor, and he grew up in conditions of extraordinary privilege. He was educated by the best teachers in the empire. He was groomed for power from childhood. He was, by the accounts of those who met him, physically magnificent, tall, strong, handsome in a way that seemed to radiate health and vitality, and mentally negligible. Where his father had spent every spare moment in philosophical contemplation, Commodus spent his in athletic training, gladiatorial practice, and the company of people whose primary qualification was their willingness to tell him that he was exceptional. He was 17 when his father made him co-emperor, and 18 when Marcus Aurelius died in 188 AD, leaving him the sole ruler of the Roman world. His first act as sole emperor was to end the Danubian campaigns that his father had spent years carefully prosecuting, concluding a peace that many Romans regarded as premature and strategically unwise, and returning to Rome. It was an understandable choice for a young man who had spent most of his youth in military camps. He wanted to go home, but it set a pattern that would define his reign: the preference for personal comfort over duty, for the pleasures available in the capital over the grinding responsibilities of imperial administration. The gladiatorial obsession that would come to define Commodus's image in history did not emerge once. It grew gradually by his physical gifts, his need for admiration, and the peculiar dynamic of power meant he could never truly be challenged. Anything, he began appearing in the arena, initially at private performances, then increasingly in public. As a gladiator, he fought animals with enthusiasm and skill. He reportedly killed a rhinoceros, a hippopotamus, ostriches, elephants, and a vast number of lions and leopards during his staged hunts, using a variety of weapons. He was, by all accounts, genuinely expert at this, which made the exhibitions no less bizarre from a Roman perspective, since in no Rome respectable and citizen, let alone a Roman emperor, would demean him himself performing in the arena like a hired fighter. He began to identify himself with Hercules, the great hero of myth, the son of Jupiter, who had cleansed the world of monsters through 12 legendary labors. He renamed Rome Colonia Lonia Luciania Commogia, Commodus's colony. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He renamed the Senate the Commodian Fortunate Senate. He renamed the legions after himself. He appeared in public dressed as Hercules, wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club, and demanded to be addressed as Hercules, the son of Jupiter, not merely as emperor. He had statues of Hercules around Rome, given his own facial features. In the arena, this took on a particularly dark quality. Commodus would dress in the lion's skin and wield the club, and crippled men would be dressed as mythological monsters, men who had lost their feet, or whose legs had been amputated, and forced to crawl around the arena floor on their hands while Commodus beat them to death with his club, reenacting the labors of Hercules against the creatures of legend. Ancient sources describe senators and knights in the audience being required to watch performances with an enthusiastic expressions on pain of severe consequences. The humiliation was absolute and systematic. His assassination in 192 AD was a collaborative effort of genuine desperation. His chief mistress, Marcia, was involved, along with the praetorian prefect and the emperor's chamberlain. They first tried poison, which made him ill but did not kill him. A wrestling partner named Narcissus was then brought in and strangled him in his bath. He was 31 years old. The man who succeeded him, Pernax, was a capable general of modest origins, everything Commodus was not, and lasted 87 days before the Praetorian Guard murdered him in turn. Rome's capacity for producing monsters had not been exhausted by Commodus's death. It had barely gotten started. Chapter 5e. Caracalla, Blood, and the purple, the Naricalla. The Nicala was a nickname-derived type of Gallic hooded cloak that he popularized in Rome. A man of the people, a people affectation, from an emperor who was, in practice, one of the most murderous that Rome ever produced. His actual name was Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus, and he came to power in a manner that set the tone for everything that followed by having his brother murdered. He had been co-emperor with his brother Geta since their father Septimius Severus died in 211 AD. The two brothers loathed each other with a passion that their father had recognized and feared but been unable to prevent. He had reportedly urged them to love each other, or failing that, to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else. Caracalla took the second part of that advice with devastating literalism. Within months of their father's death, he arranged a meeting with his brother under the pretense of reconciliation in their mother's apartments. When Geta arrived, Caracalla's soldiers were waiting. Geta died in his mother Julia Domna's arms, while she tried to shield him with her body and sustained wounds on her own hands from the blades. Caracalla, then went to the Praetorian barracks and told the soldiers that he had killed his brother in self-defense. He distributed an enormous donative, a cash payment, to secure their loyalty. The Senate was not consulted. It was not asked. It was informed. What followed was a reign defined by military loyalty purchased with money, by a contempt for civilian institutions that bordered on the theatrical, and an intimate, personal relationship with violence that made even his soldiers uncomfortable at times. He did not merely order executions, he participated in them. He reportedly killed people with his own hands. He was intensely proud of his physical strength and his soldiers' hardness. He cultivated deliberately the image of a man who was not above bloodshed, who did not delegate the messy work of power to others. His relationship with Alexander the Great was one of the stranger features an already strange reign. He admired Alexander with an intensity that went beyond admiration into identification. He dressed Macedonian troops in the fashion of Alexander's armies. He referred to Alexander constantly in his public speeches and private conversations. When he visited Egypt and came to Alexandria, a city that bore Alexander's name and housed his tomb, he reportedly prostrated himself before the conqueror's sarcophagus in genuine reverence. And then, because Alexandrians had been mocking him with satirical jacks about his side, he invited the young men of the city to a ceremonial and had them massacred. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 12 AD granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the Roman Empire, is one of the most sweeping legal reforms in ancient history, and it carries Caracalla's name. Scholars debate his motivation. Some argue genuine idealism. Others point out that citizens paid inheritance tax and non-citizens did not, making the reform a tax expansion program dressed in philosophical clothing. Whatever the motivation, the practical effect ingrading England islands of thousands of people into the Roman legal and civic system in a single declaration. He was killed in 17 AD in an undignified manner, entirely suited to the quality of his reign. He had stopped at the side of the road near the city of Carrhae in Mesopotamia to urinate, attended only by a single bodyguard. That bodyguard, a soldier named Martialis, who had a personal grievance against the emperor involving the execution of his brother, stabbed him in the back. He died on the road, unattended, like an ordinary traveler, while his escort waited at a discreet distance. He was 29 years old. His successor was an equestrian prefect named Macrinus, who had arranged the assassination and who was himself murdered by soldiers loyal to the Severan dynasty 14 months later. Rome's cycle of violence had its own merciless momentum. Chapter 6, Elagabalus, the Priest, emperor. Of all the figures in Roman history, who might be classified as extraordinary. And Rome produced an extraordinary number of extraordinary people. Elagabalus stands apart in ways that remain remarkable even by the standards of a world that had already produced Gula and Nero. He was emperor from 218 to 222 AD. From the age of roughly 14 to 18, a reign of barely 4 years that nevertheless generated enough scandal and genuine historical complexity to keep scholars arguing across 2,000 years. He was born Marcellus Aurelius Antoninus, a boy of Syrian origin from the priestly family at Almessa, modern Homs, who served as hereditary priests of the sun god Elagabal, an ancient Semitic deity whose worship centered on a black conical stone, possibly a meteorite, that was considered the god's physical manifestation. His mother Julia Soeamias and his grandmother Julia Maiasa, a formidable woman who had spent years at the imperial court in Rome, spread the story that he was actually the illegitimate son of the Emperor Caracalla, and the Eastern legions, starved for a connection to the old Severan dynasty, accepted the story and proclaimed the boy emperor. He came to Rome in 219 AD as both emperor and high priest, and immediately made clear that his religious duties were his primary identity. He brought the sacred stone of Elagabal to Rome and installed it in an temple on the Palatine Hill, declaring the Syrian Sunyan, God the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, superior to Jupiter, to Mars, to the entire constellation of traditional Roman religion. Every morning, he performed elaborate ritual sacrifice, dancing around the altar barefoot in the Phoenician style, dressed in priestly robes of silk, and a gold ringand found effeminate and foreign, offering the blood of 100 bulls at once, sprinkling the altars with the finest Syrian wines, creating clouds of incense so thick that the air around the temple shook with it. The Roman senatorial class found everything hin and offense, tradition, and dignity. Silk was considered a scandalous luxury fabric at this period in Rome, barely acceptable even for women. He wore quantities of jewelry. He performed his priestly duties in public with a dedication and physical expressiveness that Roman observers found bewildering and distasteful. He was said to have searched throughout the empire, a man of enormous physical and physical endowment, to serve as the sun god's earthly consort. Finding a charioteer named Hierocles who satisfied his requirements, entered into a relationship with him that he described openly as a marriage, calling himself Hierocles' wife, Empress. He married a Vestal virgin, one of the sacred guardians of Rome's eternal flame, whose chastity was not merely a personal, but a cosmic guarantee of Rome's continued safety, protected by penalties of being buried alive if violated. He did this not through rape, through origin, through formal marriage ceremony, explaining that the union of the high priest of the sun god with the highest priestess of the Roman religious tradition was theologically appropriate and symbolically powerful. He divorced her and remarried several times, at one point taking as his official divine consort a statue of the Carthaginian goddess Caelestis. He had brought to Rome to be the sun god's heavenly bride. His grandmother, Julia Maiasa, understood early that his behavior was unsustainable and was destroying the dynasty she had worked to maintain. She urged him repeatedly to moderate his conduct, to perform the ceremonies that Roman tradition demanded. To show at least the appearance of respect for the Senate and the institutions of Roman religion. He was not interested in appearances. He was, by all evidence, entirely sincere in his religious identity and his contempt for the compromises that Roman imperial dignity required. Julia Maia's solution was to shift her support to his cousin, a boy named Alexianus, whom she had him adopt as his heir under the name Alexander Severus, the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty to Elagabalus had never been deep, was cultivated. March 222 AD, soldiers surrounded Elagabalus, killed both, dragged their bodies through the streets, Rome, and threw them into the Tiber River. He was approximately 18 years old. Rome had a new emperor, and the stone of Elagabal went back to Syria, and the Vestal virgins resumed their traditional duties. And everyone agreed that it had been an aberration. But the aberration had lasted 4 years and had challenged, in ways that Romans found deeply unsettling, virtually every assumption about what a Roman emperor was supposed to be. Chapter 7. Sulla. Dictator walked away before the emperors, before the Julio-Claudians and the Flavians, and the Severins and all the dynasty names that history has given to Rome's imperial families. There was the Republic, the 500-year experiment in senatorial governance that had built the empire before it was an empire, that had defeated Carthage and conquered Greece, and stretched Roman power from Spain to Syria. And within that republic, as it strained under its own success and began to tear apart at the seams, there was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who deserves his place in any accounting of Rome's most extraordinary and terrifying figures. Sulla came from an old but impoverished patrician family, and he spent his early career climbing the military ladder with the methodical competence that Roman aristocratic culture demanded. He served under the general Marius, a relationship that would define both their careers and ultimately help destroy the Republic, and distinguished himself in the wars in Africa and in the first struggles against the invading Germanic tribes. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely brilliant general, physically imposing, with the strange, pale blue eyes and the mottled reddish complexion that ancient sources described as giving him the appearance of a mulberry sprinkled with flour. Not a flattering image, but memorable. The civil war between Sulla and his former commander Marius was the first of Rome's great civil conflicts, the template for all the catastrophes that followed. When the Senate assigned command of the war against Mithridates of Pontus, and Marius maneuvered to have the command transferred to himself, Sulla didn't think the dumb something thing no Roman general had ever done before. He marched his army on Rome. He captured the city. He drove Marius into exile. He then went to fight his war in the east, leaving Rome in the hands of men he believed were loyal, and Marius, who was not a man who gave up easily, came back, recaptured Rome, and massacred Sulla's supporters with an enthusiasm that demonstrated the new grammar of Roman politics, that the penalty for losing was death. Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC, having defeated Mithridates and accumulated enormous wealth and an army of devoted soldiers, and he marched on Rome a second time. The war that followed was brutal, decisive. Sulla won, and then he did something that had not been done in over a century. He had himself appointed dictator, the ancient emergency office, the office that gave one man absolute authority over the state for a limited period. But Sulla's dictatorship was not a temporary emergency measure. It was a systematic reconstruction of Roman politics, enforced by a systematic terror that had no precedent. Proscriptions were his instrument. Lists were posted in the Forum, lists of men who were declared enemies of the state, whose property was confiscated, whose killers were rewarded. They were Roman citizens. They were senators, knights, wealthy businessmen, army officers, men whose only crime in many cases was that they had backed the wrong side in the Civil War, or that they owned property someone more powerful than themselves wanted, or that a personal enemy had found it convenient to have their name added to the list. Thousands were killed. The exact number is debated, but the ancient sources speak of tens of thousands, and even if those numbers are inflated by the horror of posterity, the scale was enormous and unprecedented. And then, in 79 BC, Sulla resigned. He walked away from the dictatorship, restored the republic's traditional forms, though deeply modified in ways that reflected his constitutional preferences, retired to his country estate in Campania, and spent his final months writing his memoirs and dying, apparently of liver failure, complicated by an infestation of lice that ancient sources describe with a clinical unpleasantness that suggests they found it appropriately symbolic. He died in 78 BC, and Rome held its breath, expecting the chaos to resume immediately. It did, eventually, but Sulla's legacy was permanent and catastrophic. He had demonstrated that Roman institutions were not, in the end, protected by anything except the willingness of those who commanded armies to respect them. Julius Caesar would learn that lesson and apply it. So would Augustus. So would every emperor who came after. Chapter 8. Crassus, the man who bought Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, was not bad. He was not cruel in any theatrical sense. He did not dress as a god or massacre his political rivals in the Forum. He was, in many ways, entirely rational, which is precisely why he belongs in this account. Because his particular form of excess was one that the modern world finds uncomfortably familiar. He was the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest private individual in the known world, and he used that wealth to purchase political influence, military command, and ultimately catastrophic death in the Parthian dirt, all with the same methodical calculation that he applied to every action. He was born around 115 BC into of senatorial rank, but no great rake, but marched in. And he watched as the violence of the Marian and Sullan civil wars destroyed families, confiscated estates, and redistributed wealth with random brutality. He appears to have drawn a simple, practical lesson from this observation. that in a world of violence and instability, money was the most reliable form of power, because it could be hidden, transferred, multiplied, and converted into other kinds of power as circumstances demanded. He became famous first as a real estate speculator of genius and ruthlessness. Rome burned regularly. The ancient city was a labyrinth of narrow streets and wooden apartment buildings, the insulae stacked high and densely packed, and fire was a constant catastrophe. Crassus organized a firefighting company, 500 trained slaves, and when a fire broke out, he would arrive at the scene while the building burned and offer to buy the burning property. And the neighboring properties, which were about to burn, at whatever price the desperate owners would accept. Once the sale was agreed, his firefighters would extinguish the blaze. If the sale could not be negotiated, the firefighters watched the building burn. He acquired hundreds of properties this way. He then rebuilt them and rented them out at profit. He applied the same logic to the property confiscations of Sulla's proscriptions, buying condemned men's estates at the fractions of their true value that government sales under duress produced. He expanded into silver mining, into trading companies, into lending, and the lending operation may have been his most important political tool, because half of Rome's senatorial class was perpetually in debt, and Crassus held much of that debt, which meant that he held, in a very practical sense, much of political loyalty. He financed Julius Caesar's early career. He financed Cicero. He financed Pompey. He was the invisible engine behind the careers of the men who would eventually destroy the Republic. And he did it all because it was profitable, because political influence was as an investment like any other, and because the return on investment in Roman politics was, when managed correctly, spectacular. His military ambition was his undoing. He had watched as Pompey and Caesar accumulated military glory, the foundation of Roman prestige, and he wanted it for himself. In 53 BC, as the senior member of the First Triumvirate, he took command of the war against Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival. He was 60 years old. He had never commanded a major campaign. He marched his army into Mesopotamia with confidence that was not supported by adequate knowledge of the terrain, the enemy, or the realities of warfare in the eastern desert. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Carthaginian cavalry, specifically the cataphracts, the heavily armored lancers, and the horse archers, destroyed the Roman legions with a tactical efficiency that was appalling even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. The Romans formed the testudo formation, the tortoise of interlocking shields, but the Parthian Rs simply waited, circling at a distance, firing methodically. 7 of Crassus's legions were effectively destroyed. His son Publius was killed in a flanking action, and his head was paraded before the Roman lines on a spear. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations treacherously, in the manner of things, and his severed head was reportedly sent to the Parthian king, who ordered molten gold to be poured into its mouth. A theatrical commentary on Crassus' renowned thirst for wealth that resonated across the ancient world. His death left the first triumvirate in tatters and Rome hurdling the final crisis that would end the Republic. Chapter 9. Tiberius. The reluctant monster Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. He is the most difficult of Rome's first emperors to assess, because the evidence is so deeply contaminated by the hostility of the men who wrote it. Tacitus despised him. Suetonius catalogued his vices with an enthusiasm that sometimes strains credibility. Ancient Rome had no shortage of writers who found Tiberius a satisfying villain, and yet modern historians who look carefully at the evidence find something more complicated. A genuinely brilliant general and an administrator who was perhaps the worst possible fit for the role he inherited, who was in many ways the victim of a system he had not chosen and could not escape, and who responded to that trap by becoming, in the later years of his reign, genuinely terrible. He was born in 42 BC, the stepson of Augustus, and he spent his career in the shadow of a genius. Augustus was everything that Tiberius was not: charming, politically intuitive, comfortable in the performance of power, able to maintain the fiction that the Republic still existed while systematically dismantling it. Tiberius was blunt, suspicious, deeply uncomfortable with the personal warmth that Roman political culture demanded, and constitutionally incapable of the flattery that senators expected from a ruler who wanted their cooperation. He had been a genuinely exceptional general. His campaigns along the Rhine and the Danube were models of methodical military competence. But the political theater of the Principate was not a role that suited him. He became emperor in 1480 at the age of 55. Already exhausted, digid by decades of service to an emperor who had repeatedly passed him over for less qualified successors before those successors died, and he became the only option remaining. His reign began with what appeared to be genuine constitutional modesty. He insisted he was merely a servant of the Senate, that he did not want autocratic power, that the Senate should govern. The Senate, which had spent the previous 40 years learning to do exactly what the emperor wanted, interpreted this as either a test or a lie, and responded with fawning deference that Tiberius found contemptible. He was trapped. He could not behave like a senator because he was an emperor, and he could not behave like Augustus because he was not Augustus. And the Senate's servility was simultaneously the thing he had created and the thing he despised. His relationship with his adopted son Germanicus, the beloved general, father of Caligula, was the central political drama of his early reign. Germanicus was everything Rome wanted in a future emperor: brave, charming, popular, the image of the ideal Roman hero. Tiberius was everything Rome did not want in a present emperor. The tension between them was managed with difficulty while Germanicus lived. But when Germanicus died in Syria in 19 AD, under circumstances that at minimum involved the hostility of Tiberius's political agent Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, and quite possibly involved deliberate poisoning, public grief turned into something darker and more. Germanicus's widow Agrippina the Elder became a focus of opposition to Tiberius, a living symbol of what Rome had lost and what it feared it would never regain. The rise of Sejanus was the transfer that transformed Tiberius from a difficult emperor into a genuinely dangerous one. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, and he possessed in abundance the political intelligence and personal charm that Tiberius lacked. He made himself indispensable. He convinced Tiberius to consolidate the Praetorian Guard into a single large barracks near Rome. Previously, the Guard had been distributed across the city in smaller units, which gave Sejanus direct command, a concentrated military force in the capital. He identified and destroyed Tiberius's enemies with terrifying efficiency. He executed Agrippina's supporters one by one, using the treason laws that Tiberius Hadrianus had revived, laws that made it illegal to harm the dignity of the Roman state, laws that could be striver almost any criticism of the emperor or his regime. And then Tiberius retreated to Capri. In 26 AD, he left Rome for what turned out to be the rest of his life, never returning to the city, governing the empire through correspondence, and through Sejanus. Capri became the locus of all the horror that Suetonius attributes to these years: orgies, executions conducted for entertainment, people thrown from the island's cliffs into the sea, a schematic debauchery that may owe more to Suetonius's imagination than to historical reality, but which reflected what Rome feared was happening in the absence any oversight. The fall of Sejanus in 31 AD, as sudden as his rise had been gradual. Tiberius, somehow from Capri, decided that his trusted servant had become too powerful, was perhaps plotting to replace him, had certainly been guilty of crimes including the murder of his son Drusus, who had died years earlier of what was now revealed to have been poison administered by Sejanus. In a single letter read to the Senate, Tiberius dissed the most powerful man, a man in Rome. Sejanus was arrested, executed that same day, his body thrown in the Tiber, his family destroyed. And then the treason trials continued, now directed against Sejanus's associates. And Rome found itself in the nightmarish logic of a purge that followed, where the victims of the first wave might be rehabilitated or might be implicated, where no one knew the emperor believed or wanted, and where survival required a degree of political calculation that would exhaust a mathematician. Tiberius died in 37 AD at his villa in Misenum, 77. Persistent rumors, both ancient and modern, that he'd not die naturally, that Caligula, or the Praetorian prefect Macro, hastened the end in one way or another. He left behind an empire that was physically intact and administratively functioning, a treasury that was full, and a senate that had been so thoroughly cowed and degraded that it would never recover the independent political culture it had once possessed. He left behind Caligula, and Rome moved on. Chapter 10. The legacy of madness. That what patches U.S. Rome does not teach us that power corrupts in any simple, mechanical way. The men in this account were not uniform in their madness or their cruelty. Some were born to darkness. Some were driven there by circumstance. Some were simply ordinary men, neither especially good nor especially evil, who found themselves in positions of absolute power and discovered that absolute power does not require any particular quality of soul. It requires only the absence of constraint. The Roman Empire lasted, in various forms and by various definitions, for over 1,000 years after the deaths of the men described in these pages. It produced, alongside its monsters, genuinely great administrators, capable generals, philosophers, emperors, and rulers of such competence that their names are still used as reference points for good governance. The Antonine period, which followed the horrors of Domitian and Commodus, gave Rome Marcus Aurelius. The Severan period, for all its violence, produced some of the most sophisticated legal scholars in ancient history. Rome was not simply a machine for producing madmen. It was a civilization of extraordinary complexity and duration. But its madmen are what echo loudest through time, and there is a reason for that. They are mirrors. When we look at Caligula, the boy who survived terror by learning to smile when he was afraid, who finally stopped smiling and showed what was underneath. We are looking at something recognizable about the psychology of trauma and power. When we look at Nero, the man who wanted to be an artist and became instead the ruler of an empire that had no place for what he was. Looking at recognizable about the violence that can erupt from a person cannot be what they need to be. When we look at Domitian staging his black dinner party, terrifying his enemies with a demonstration that their lives were entirely in his control, we are looking at something recognizable about the need for control that power simultaneously creates and can never satisfy. The Romans themselves knew what their monsters meant. They invented the concept of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, the attempt to rid the bad emperor from history by destroying his statues and scratching his name from inscriptions. But they also kept writing about them in account after account, with a mixture of horror and fascination that entirely modern. Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, they wrote about the emperors not to forget them but to remember them in a particular way, to make sense of what human beings could become when given absolute power, to warn their readers about what lay beneath the marble and the civilization. The marble is still there in fragments, in museums and ruins and the foundations of buildings that replaced buildings in the cities of the ancient Mediterranean. The Colosseum stands. The Forum stands, or its bones do. The columns and the arches and the paving stones that were already old when Nero built his golden house and Demetrius staged his black dinner and Caligula announced that he was a god. The names survive too, not scratched out, not forgotten, not condemned to the oblivion that Roman law could impose, but history consistently refused. Domitian, Commodus, they survive because they tell us something true about what humanity is capable of, about what civilization is and is not capable of preventing, about the distance between the laws we write and the people we remain when those laws cease to be enforced. 2,000 years have passed since Caligula rode his horse across the Bay of Baiae in Alexander's breastplate, proving that the prophecy was wrong and that he emperor and that he could do anything he wanted. 2,000 years have passed since Nero pressed his own throat against a blade in a suburban villa and said that the world was losing a great artist. 2,000 years have passed since Domitian sent silver gravestones to the senators who had survived his black dinner and understood in the morning what the night had meant. The empire they misruled is dust. The roads they traveled are still walked. The aqueducts they built still channel water in some places, and their stories are still told, still argued over, still capable of disturbing a quiet evening with the recognition that the cruelty and the curiosity and the fear and the hunger for Rome, in the end, is not a comfortable place to spend time, but it is an honest one, and honesty, in history as in life, is worth more than comfort. The stone knows what it knows. The dust remembers, and the story, as it always has, continues.